Montana Territory, 1878. The land was as beautiful as it was unforgiving. Golden prairie grasses stretching to distant mountains that seemed to hold up the endless blue sky. Quinn Forester stood at the edge of his sprawling ranch, surveying the thousands of acres that bore his name. At 26, he was already a legend in Paradise Valley, the youngest man to build a cattle empire this side of the Yellowstone River. His hands were calloused from labor, his shoulders broad from years of breaking horses and driving cattle. Yet for all his success, Quinn believed the frontier demanded solitude from a man. A rancher lives and dies by his own hand. His father had told him before consumption took him 5 winters past. The moment you let someone else matter, you've handed the world a weapon to use against you. Those words had shaped Quinn's existence. He'd built Forester Ranch into 3,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory, with a herd approaching 2,000 head, all without letting anyone close enough to matter. The ranch hands respected him, but knew to keep their distance from the boss. Quinn figured that's how it had to be. The West wasn't made for softness or sentiment. It was made for men who stood alone against everything life could throw at them. As spring sunshine warmed his face, Quinn watched a small wagon approaching along the eastern trail. Unusual to have visitors this far out. Most folks knew Forester Ranch was a working operation, not a social call. He squinted against the sun, making out a single figure driving a weathered wagon pulled by a tired-looking mule. Trouble, most likely. Trouble always found its way to your doorstep in Montana. The same week that brought the mysterious wagon also brought news that the Northern Pacific Railroad would be laying tracks through Paradise Valley. Land that had been worthless 2 years ago would soon be worth fortunes. Quinn had built his empire through backbreaking work, but now speculators and land grabbers would descend like locusts. A man couldn't trust anyone these days, especially strangers in wagons. Quinn's hand drifted to the Colt revolver on his hip as the wagon drew closer. He wasn't one to take chances. Grace Whitaker gripped the worn reins of her mule with determination, though her hands were raw and blistered. At 19, she had already seen more hardship than most women twice her age. Her chestnut hair was tied back with a faded ribbon, and her blue calico dress had been mended so many times it was more patched than original fabric. But her eyes, a striking shade of green, still held a stubborn spark that 6 months of frontier hardship hadn't extinguished. The letter in her pocket felt heavy as a stone. Land available for settlement, Paradise Valley, Montana Territory. Her father had staked their future on those words before pneumonia took him just outside of Bozeman. With her mother long dead and no family back east, Grace had pressed on alone, determined to claim the homestead he'd paid for with their last dollars. What the land office hadn't mentioned was that the available homestead parcel lay directly adjacent to the massive Forester Ranch, whose owner had reportedly run off the last 3 settlers who tried to build there. The clerk had smirked when handing her the deed. "Good luck, miss. That land's as good as Forester's already." As Grace approached what she believed was the boundary of her claim, she spotted a tall figure watching from horseback on a nearby rise. Even from a distance, she could feel the intensity of his gaze. This must be the infamous Quinn Forester, the man who, according to town gossip, had built an empire through sheer force of will and considered the entire valley his domain. Grace lifted her chin. She hadn't come all this way to be intimidated. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Never let them see your fear, Gracie. Fear is a luxury poor folks can't afford." She steered her wagon toward the rider, determined to establish her right to be there from the start. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her hands remained steady on the reins. The land promised a creek, timber, and enough fertile soil to build a life. She had nowhere else to go. The rider began moving toward her, and Grace squared her shoulders. Everything she owned in the world was in this wagon. Everything she hoped for lay in this valley. As the distance between them closed, she could make out his features, younger than she'd expected, with a face that might have been handsome if not set in such a forbidding expression. Grace Whitaker had never backed down from a challenge in her life. She wasn't about to start now, not even for the giant of a rancher bearing down on her like an approaching storm. "This is Forester land," Quinn called out when the wagon came within earshot. He kept his tone even but firm, the same voice he used when breaking a spirited horse. No need for shouting when quiet authority worked better. "You've taken a wrong turn, miss." The young woman pulled her mule to a stop, sitting straighter on the wagon seat. I believe I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, sir. I'm Grace Whitaker, and I have papers for the homestead claim on Cedar Creek. Quinn's jaw tightened. Another settler with worthless papers from land speculators back east who didn't know territory boundaries. The railroad announcement had them swarming like flies to honey. Cedar Creek runs through Forester Ranch. Has for 8 years now. He gestured to the rolling hills behind him. All this, from the Yellowstone to those foothills, that's Forester land. Your papers are worthless. Instead of the defeat he expected, the woman, Grace, pulled out a folded document from her pocket. My deed is registered with the Territorial Land Office in Bozeman. The southeast quarter section along Cedar Creek is open for homesteading under federal law. Her voice had a surprising steadiness to it. I intend to claim what's legally mine. Quinn had intimidated men twice his size with nothing more than a look, but this slip of a woman met his gaze without flinching. Something about her, perhaps the determined set of her chin or the flash of intelligence in those green eyes, caught him off guard. The land office makes mistakes, he said, moving his horse closer. Or they sell claims they have no right to sell. Either way, I'm not letting some Easterner cut into my water rights. I'm not from the East, Grace replied. I'm from Kansas. My father and I worked our farm until drought took everything. He paid for this claim with the last money we had. Her voice caught, just barely, before she continued. He died getting me here. I won't dishonor him by turning back now. The mention of her father's death pierced something in Quinn he thought long calloused over. He knew loss, knew how it could drive a person to desperate measures. Still, his responsibility was to the ranch. One homesteader today meant 20 next month. I'm sorry for your troubles, Miss Whitaker, but my answer stands. Find somewhere else to settle. To his surprise, she clicked to her mule and drove her wagon forward, right past him. The law gives me the right to claim this land if I improve it and live on it for 5 years, she called over her shoulder. I intend to do just that. Quinn watched, momentarily stunned by her audacity, as she guided her wagon down toward the creek where the disputed claim lay. In 8 years of ranching, he'd never encountered anyone, man or woman, with such nerve. A grim smile touched his lips. She had spirit, he'd give her that. But spirit alone wouldn't help her survive a Montana winter. By first snowfall, she'd be gone, one way or another. 3 days later, Quinn rode to the ridge overlooking Cedar Creek, telling himself he was checking fence lines. The real reason stood plain as day on the small clearing by the creek, a half-built cabin of rough-hewn logs. He had to admit, the woman worked harder than most men he'd hired. From dawn till dusk, she'd been felling small trees, stripping branches, and slowly raising walls. The cabin was crude and would barely keep out summer rain, let alone winter snow, but her determination was undeniable. Quinn dismounted, leading his horse down the slope. He'd given her time to come to her senses. Now he needed to make his position absolutely clear before she wasted any more effort. Grace was struggling with a log too heavy for her slender frame when he approached. Sweat dampened her hair, and her dress was smudged with dirt and pine sap. She looked up at his approach, but didn't stop working. Still here, I see, Quinn observed, keeping his tone neutral. Still my land, I see. She replied without missing a beat, though her arms trembled with the weight of the log. Without thinking, Quinn stepped forward and took the other end, helping her lift it into place on the growing wall. Her surprised expression quickly gave way to caution. I didn't ask for your help, Mr. Forester, and I didn't offer it. Just saving time. He stepped back once the log was settled. This cabin won't stand through October. The first heavy snow will collapse that roof design. Grace wiped her hands on her apron. I suppose you know everything about building cabins? I know about surviving Montana winters. That's a shallow pitch. Snow will pile up until the weight breaks those supports. He pointed to the roof beams she'd started laying out. You need a steeper angle, stronger center beam. She studied him, wariness in her eyes. Why would you tell me that? You want me gone. Quinn wasn't entirely sure himself. I want you gone by choice, not frozen to death on my doorstep. Bad for business to have dead homesteaders on neighboring land. Something flashed in her eyes. Anger, pride, determination, all mixed into one challenging look. I appreciate the advice, unwanted as it is. Now, unless you're here to help me rebuild properly, I have work to do. Quinn should have ridden away. Instead, he found himself saying, your chimney stones aren't fitted right either. First backdraft will fill that cabin with smoke. He nodded toward the crude stone fireplace she'd begun. Grace crossed her arms. As I said, Mr. Forester, unless you're offering help. I'm not, he said firmly. Yet something made him add, though I might have some supplies at the ranch that would otherwise go to waste. Roofing materials. Proper stones for a chimney. She raised an eyebrow, clearly suspicious of this sudden change. And what would you want in exchange? Want? Nothing. Consider it an investment in not having to rescue you come winter. He turned toward his horse, then looked back. And an understanding that Cedar Creek's water remains open to my cattle. The law may give you the land, but water rights in Montana are another matter entirely. For a long moment, Grace said nothing. Then she lifted her chin in that defiant way that somehow irritated and impressed him simultaneously. I can accept that condition. But understand something, Mr. Forester. I'm not going anywhere. Not in winter, not in spring, not ever. This is my home now. Quinn mounted his horse, looking down at the determined young woman with her impossible task. Against his better judgment, he found himself respecting her grit, even as he remained certain she'd eventually fail. We'll see, was all he said as he rode away, already questioning why he'd offered her anything at all. The next morning, Grace was splitting kindling when she heard wagon wheels approaching. She straightened, pushing loose strands of hair from her face, and watched as a team of horses pulled a loaded wagon into her clearing. Quinn Forester himself handled the reins, with one of his ranch hands beside him. The wagon contained far more than the few supplies he'd vaguely mentioned. Proper timber for roof beams, cut stone for the chimney, real glass for a window, iron hinges for a door, and more tools than she'd ever possessed. Grace approached cautiously as Quinn jumped down from the wagon. This is more than I expected. Like I said, materials that would go to waste otherwise. His expression remained unreadable. My man here, Jenkins, knows cabin building. He'll help today, then it's on you. Grace felt her defenses rise. I didn't ask for charity, Mr. Forester. And I don't offer it, he replied sharply. Consider this protecting my investment. If you're determined to stay, better you have a sound structure than a fire hazard next to my grazing land. Before she could respond, Quinn turned to direct Jenkins in unloading the supplies. Grace watched, conflicted between gratitude for the much-needed materials and suspicion of his motives. No man did something for nothing, especially not in the Montana Territory. Throughout the day, Quinn worked alongside Jenkins, tearing down her poorly constructed walls and showing her the proper way to notch logs for stability. Despite her initial resistance, Grace found herself learning quickly, asking questions that he answered with surprising patience. By mid-afternoon, the cabin had transformed from a precarious structure to the beginnings of a solid shelter. As they paused for water, Grace noticed Quinn studying her small vegetable garden with a critical eye. That soil needs manure if you expect anything to grow, he observed. I'm well aware, she replied. I'll figure it out. Quinn wiped his brow, leaving a streak of dirt across his forehead. You've never actually farmed before, have you? Grace stiffened. My father and I had a wheat farm in Kansas. Wheat's different from vegetables, and Kansas soil isn't Montana soil. He gestured to her neat rows of seedlings. Those will wither before they produce anything edible. I suppose you know everything about farming too, she challenged. To her surprise, a hint of a smile touched his lips. No, cattle's my business. But my mother kept gardens that fed 20 ranch hands through winter. She knew soil. The mention of his mother, the first personal detail he'd revealed, caught Grace off guard. Then what would she suggest? Quinn looked at her garden again, then back to the cabin. Finish this roof today. Tomorrow, I'll send over some composted manure. Mix it in before those seedlings die. Grace wanted to refuse, to prove she needed nothing from him, but practicality won out. Thank you, she said simply. He nodded, then returned to work without another word. By sunset, the cabin had 4 solid walls, a properly pitched roof, and a chimney that wouldn't smoke her out at the first fire. As Quinn and Jenkins prepared to leave, Grace stood in front of her new home with mixed emotions. I don't understand why you're helping me, she finally said. Quinn secured the empty wagon. Neither do I. He looked at her small homestead, then at the young woman who'd done what no one else had dared, stand up to him on his own territory. You still won't make it through winter alone. Grace smiled for the first time since he'd met her. The transformation lit her face in a way that made him look twice. I'm stronger than I look, "Mr. Forester," she said. As he climbed onto the wagon, Quinn found himself wondering if perhaps she was right. Over the next 3 weeks, an uneasy truce settled between them. True to his word, Quinn sent over manure for her garden, along with seed potatoes that would better suit the Montana soil. Grace, for her part, worked from sunrise to sunset, determined to prove she could survive on her own. Quinn told himself his occasional rides past her homestead were merely to check his property boundaries, but he couldn't deny a growing curiosity about the stubborn young woman. Sometimes he'd find himself offering advice: where to dig her well for the best water, which wild berries were safe to preserve for winter, how to reinforce her chicken coop against foxes and weasels. One afternoon in late June, Quinn arrived to find Grace fighting a smoking chimney, coughing as she tried to adjust the flue he'd installed. "You've got it backward," he called out, dismounting without waiting for invitation. "Pull that lever toward you, not away." Grace did as instructed, and the smoke immediately began drawing properly up the chimney. She stepped outside, eyes watering from the smoke. "I thought I understood how it worked." "Trial and error," he said with a shrug. "Took me 3 tries when I built my first cabin." She looked at him with surprise. "You didn't always have that big ranch house I've heard about in town." Quinn leaned against the cabin wall. "Started with less than you have. 1-room cabin, 10 head of cattle, and more determination than sense." He surprised himself with this admission. He rarely spoke of those early days. Grace wiped her hands on her apron. "Would you like some coffee? It's the least I can offer for the chimney help." Quinn hesitated, then nodded. Something about her directness made it difficult to maintain his usual distance. Inside, the cabin was transformed from the shell he'd helped build. Though small, Grace had created a genuine home. Curtains made from flour sacks, a table fashioned from packing crates, dried wildflowers in a jar by the window. A patchwork quilt brightened the narrow bed in the corner. "You've done a lot with very little," he observed, accepting the tin cup she offered. "That's been the story of my life, Mr. Forester." She sat across from him at the small table. "When you start with nothing, you learn to make something from whatever's at hand." The coffee was surprisingly good, strong and hot. As he sipped, Quinn noticed a worn book of poetry on her shelf. Wordsworth, alongside practical manuals on farming and animal husbandry. "You read poetry?" he asked, nodding toward the shelf. A slight blush colored her cheeks. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married. She believed education mattered, even, perhaps especially, on the frontier." She was right, Quinn replied, surprising himself again with this personal response. "My own mother felt the same. Insisted I learn literature alongside roping cattle." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of common ground where they'd assumed none existed. Their conversation turned to books they'd read, memories of parents who'd valued knowledge, and the strange mix of freedom and hardship that defined frontier life. As Quinn prepared to leave an hour later, he paused at the door. "There's a stream on the north edge of your claim with better trout than Cedar Creek. Deeper pools, if you're looking to supplement your provisions." Grace smiled. "Are you suggesting I might actually survive here, Mr. Forster?" He found himself returning her smile, the first genuine one he'd offered her. "You're still facing impossible odds, Miss Whitaker. But I've been wrong about a few things before." As he rode away, Quinn couldn't ignore the strange lightness in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It troubled him. Getting attached to neighbors only complicated business, especially when the railroad would soon make land disputes even more contentious. Better to maintain boundaries, both of property and emotion. Yet 3 days later, he found himself riding back to her homestead with a fresh-caught string of trout and the flimsy excuse of checking water levels in the creek. July brought scorching heat and the threat of prairie fires. Grace's garden flourished with the care she'd given it. Her chicken coop housed 6 laying hens acquired from a trip into town, and her cabin had become a true home. But the heat dried everything to tinder, and each day she scanned the horizon for smoke, knowing a fire could destroy everything in hours. Quinn's visits had become regular, though neither acknowledged the pattern forming between them. He would arrive with some practical reason, checking creek levels, tracking a mountain lion seen nearby, or delivering supplies that were surplus anyway, but increasingly stayed for coffee and conversation. For Grace, these visits became anchors in her isolated existence. Though fiercely independent, she had underestimated the loneliness of homestead life. Quinn's presence, his deep voice discussing cattle prices or debating the merits of different authors, brought human connection she hadn't realized she craved. One sweltering afternoon, Grace was hauling water from the well when Quinn galloped into her yard, tension evident in every line of his body. "Fire," he said without preamble. 3 miles east and moving this way. Winds pushing it faster than men can fight it. Grace's heart lurched. "How bad?" "Bad enough. My men are trying to cut fire breaks, but this heat has turned everything to kindling." He dismounted quickly. "Gather whatever you can't live without. You can shelter at the ranch house until it passes. My chickens, no time. Take essentials only." Grace hurried inside, mind racing. She grabbed her mother's Bible, her father's pocket watch, the deed to her land, and the small bag containing her meager savings. Everything else could be rebuilt, everything except her independence. "I'm staying," she announced as she emerged from the cabin. "We can dig a fire break around the homestead." Quinn stared at her in disbelief. "That's suicide, Grace. Even with 10 men, we couldn't circle this place fast enough." "It's my home." She lifted her chin in that defiant gesture he'd come to recognize. "I won't abandon it at the first sign of trouble." Frustration flashed across his face. "This isn't the first sign of trouble. It's a wildfire that could kill you. Be reasonable for once." "If it were your ranch, would you ride away?" she challenged. Quinn ran a hand through his hair, clearly torn between forcing her to safety and respecting her decision. Finally, he growled, 2 hours. We have maybe 2 hours before the fire reaches this far. If we haven't made enough progress by then, you're coming with me whether you like it or not." Together, they worked frantically, digging a trench around the cabin and outbuildings, clearing brush and grass, wetting down the roof and walls with precious water from the well. Grace worked until her hands blistered and her muscles screamed, aware that Quinn was matching her pace despite having already spent hours fighting the fire elsewhere. As the sun began to set, they could see the orange glow on the eastern horizon, smoke turning the sky an ominous gray. The wind carried the scent of burning grass. "It's not enough," Quinn finally said, looking at their incomplete firebreak. "The flames will jump this easily." Grace stood beside him, exhaustion making her sway slightly. "I won't leave." Quinn turned to her, his expression intense. "I've lost cattle to prairie fires. I've lost grazing land and fence lines. But I've never lost a person, and I don't intend to start with you." Before she could argue further, he strode to his horse and pulled a folded canvas from his saddlebag. "There's one more thing we can try." Working together, they created backfires along the eastern edge of her property, carefully controlling small, strategic burns to consume the fuel before the main fire arrived. It was dangerous work. One gust of wind in the wrong direction could turn their defense into a disaster. Quinn's experience proved invaluable as he calculated wind patterns and directed their efforts. As full darkness fell, they stood side by side watching the main fire reach their blackened firebreak and struggle to find fuel to continue. Sparks flew overhead, some landing dangerously close to the cabin, requiring immediate attention with wet burlap and shovelfuls of dirt. For hours, they fought together against nature's fury, neither willing to surrender. Near midnight, the wind shifted, pushing the main fire northward, away from Grace's homestead. The immediate danger had passed, though smoldering embers required vigilance throughout the night. They sat on her cabin steps, exhausted, faces streaked with soot, sharing a canteen of water. Grace's hands trembled with fatigue and delayed fear. "Thank you," she said softly. "I couldn't have saved it alone." Quinn looked at her in the dim light, his expression unreadable. "Why is this place so important to you?" "It's just land and logs." Grace was quiet for a moment. "It's the only thing that's truly mine. My whole life, I've depended on others, my parents, employers, charity when times were hard. Here, I answer to no one. Even if it's difficult, it's mine." She looked up at him. "Surely you understand that, with your ranch." He studied her face, seeing beyond the soot and exhaustion to the core of strength beneath. "I do understand." After a pause, he added, "Though no one truly survives out here alone, Grace. Not even me." The admission hung between them, revealing more than either had intended. For the first time, Grace realized that Quinn's massive ranch and apparent self-sufficiency might mask a loneliness that mirrored her own. "Stay for breakfast," she said impulsively. I might not be pretty after fighting a fire all night, sir, but I can cook. The unexpected statement broke the tension, drawing a rare laugh from Quinn. I've eaten my own cooking for 8 years. Anything would be an improvement. As dawn broke over the blackened landscape, they shared a meal of biscuits and coffee. Something had changed between them. The fire burning away pretenses and revealing a connection neither had been looking for, but both had begun to need. August brought the railroad surveyors to Paradise Valley, and with them came the speculators, lawyers, and land agents Quinn had dreaded. Suddenly, the territory was crawling with Eastern businessmen talking about progress and development while eyeing the richest grazing lands with calculating expressions. Quinn spent days in town meeting with his lawyer, securing his water rights and confirming property boundaries. The tension was evident in every line of his body when he rode to Grace's homestead one evening after a particularly difficult confrontation. "The railroad's offering to buy 500 acres of my southern range," he said without preamble as she welcomed him inside. "For a depot and stockyards." Grace set a cup of coffee before him. Over the weeks since the fire, their relationship had evolved into something neither named but both relied upon. She'd come to recognize the signs of his moods. The furrow between his brows that signaled concern, the slight lift at the corner of his mouth when something amused him. "Will you sell?" she asked, taking the seat across from him. Quinn stared into his cup. "My father would turn in his grave. He built this ranch believing in open range, not railroad towns and fenced properties. Yet you've helped me build fences," she observed quietly. "That's different." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "You work the land yourself. These railroad men, they don't care about the territory, just profit." Grace considered this. Progress comes whether we want it or not. Perhaps the question isn't whether to fight it, but how to shape it on your own terms. Quinn's expression softened. "When did you become so wise about ranching?" "I've had a good teacher these past months." Her smile made something tighten in his chest. "Though he's terribly stubborn." "Sounds familiar," he replied, returning her smile. The easy banter between them had become something he looked forward to, a respite from the battles he fought elsewhere. As they talked through his options with the railroad, Quinn realized he was asking for her opinion in a way he'd never sought counsel from anyone else. Somewhere along the way, Grace Whitaker had become not just a neighbor but a trusted friend, perhaps the only true friend he had. Later, as he prepared to leave, Quinn paused in the doorway. "There's a harvest dance in town next Saturday. The whole valley will be there." Grace raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. Quinn shifted uncomfortably, suddenly feeling like a schoolboy instead of a ranch owner. "I thought you might want to go. To meet more people in the valley." "Are you asking to escort me, Mr. Forester?" There was a teasing quality to her voice he'd come to appreciate. "I suppose I am, Miss Whitaker." He met her gaze directly. "Though I'm a poor dancer." Her smile brightened the room more effectively than her oil lamps. "I accept. Though I should warn you, my dancing skills haven't been tested since Kansas." As Quinn rode home under a canopy of stars, he found himself looking forward to Saturday with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. The railroad problems, water rights disputes, and boundary challenges all seemed less overwhelming when he thought of Grace in a dance dress, her chestnut hair freed from its practical braid. The realization stopped him cold halfway home. He was falling in love with Grace Whitaker, the very woman he'd tried to run off his land 3 months ago. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so terrifying. Love had no place in the life he'd built. Love meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant weakness. And in the Montana Territory, weakness got you killed, or worse, destroyed everything you'd built. Yet as he continued toward home, Quinn couldn't deny that something fundamental had already changed inside him. The fortress walls he'd built around his heart had been breached, and he wasn't entirely certain he wanted to repair them. The harvest dance transformed the town hall from a utilitarian meeting space to a warmly lit gathering place filled with music and laughter. Lanterns cast a golden glow over tables laden with food brought by families from across the valley. A small band of fiddle, guitar, and banjo played lively tunes that had couples swirling across the wooden floor. Grace sat beside Quinn, watching the dancers with bright eyes. She'd worn her best dress, blue calico with white trim, carefully pressed for the occasion, and arranged her chestnut hair in a style that softened her features. The months of outdoor work had brought a healthy glow to her complexion and confidence to her bearing that drew appreciative glances from several men. Those glances didn't escape Quinn's notice, nor did they improve his mood. He'd been tense since arriving in town, where railroad representatives mingled with the local ranchers and farmers, discussing their plans with enthusiasm that struck him as predatory. "You haven't asked me to dance," Grace observed after they'd been seated for half an hour. Quinn's expression was apologetic. "I warned you I'm not much of a dancer. Yet you brought me to a dance." Her smile took any sting from the words. "I don't expect perfection, Quinn. Just enjoyment." The use of his given name, something she'd only recently begun, still gave him a strange flutter in his chest. With a resigned sigh that didn't quite mask his pleasure, Quinn stood and offered his hand. "One dance, then. But don't blame me when your toes are trampled." Grace laughed, placing her hand in his. "I've survived drought, prairie fire, and your disapproval. I think I can manage crushed toes." As they joined the other couples on the floor, Quinn was acutely aware of Grace's hand in his, the other resting lightly on his shoulder. He placed his hand at her waist, careful to maintain a respectful distance while still following the dance's requirements. The music swept them into motion, and Quinn focused intently on remembering steps he hadn't used since boyhood. To his surprise, they moved well together, Grace following his lead with a natural grace that made his initial awkwardness fade. As they circled the floor, he gradually relaxed enough to look down at her face rather than his feet. "You're better at this than you claimed," she said, eyes bright with enjoyment. "You bring out unexpected qualities," he admitted. The words carried more truth than he'd intended. Something shifted in her expression, a softening, a question. Before either could speak further, the music ended, and a commotion at the door drew everyone's attention. A group of well-dressed men entered, railroad executives from the east, accompanied by land agents Quinn recognized from town meetings. One man in particular, James Harrington, the railroad's chief negotiator, scanned the room with calculating eyes that came to rest on Quinn. Mr. Forester," Harrington called across the room, his voice cutting through conversations. "The very man I hoped to see tonight." Quinn's hand tightened briefly around Grace's before he released her. "It seems business follows me even here," he said quietly. "Excuse me." As Quinn crossed to intercept Harrington before he could further disrupt the gathering, Grace found herself approached by Margaret Fellows, the shopkeeper's wife and primary source of town gossip. "My dear, you've accomplished quite a feat," Margaret said with a knowing smile. "Quinn Forester hasn't attended a social function in years, let alone danced with anyone." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "We're neighbors. Nothing more." Margaret's eyebrow arched. "Is that what they're calling it these days? The whole valley's talking about how the mighty rancher rides to your homestead nearly every day." Before Grace could formulate a response, she overheard Harrington's carrying voice from across the room. 50 acres more, and we have a deal, Forster. The stockyards need the extra space, and you'll be compensated handsomely." Quinn's response was too low to hear, but his rigid posture spoke volumes. The conversation had become increasingly tense, drawing attention from the partygoers and effectively halting the festivities. "Excuse me," Grace murmured to Margaret, moving closer to where Quinn stood confronting the railroad man. "That land includes Cedar Creek," Quinn was saying, his voice controlled but cold. "I've told you before, the water rights aren't negotiable." Harrington's smile never reached his eyes. "Water rights can be adjusted. Progress requires compromise, Mr. Forester." "Not on this." Quinn's tone left no room for discussion. The railroad man's expression hardened. "I'd reconsider if I were you. The railroad is coming, with or without your cooperation. Those who work with us prosper. Those who stand in our way." He let the implication hang. Grace had heard enough. She stepped forward, placing herself beside Quinn. "Mr. Harrington, isn't it? I'm Grace Whitaker." Both men looked at her with surprise. Harrington recovered first, offering a practiced smile. "Miss Whitaker, I've heard about your modest homestead. Cedar Creek runs through my property before it reaches Forester land," she said plainly. "Any dispute over water rights would involve me as well." Quinn shot her a warning glance, but Grace continued. "And as Mr. Forester's neighbor, I can assure you that neither of us is interested in discussing business matters at a community celebration." Harrington studied her with new interest. "You speak quite confidently for a homesteader, Miss Whitaker." I speak as someone who understands the value of good neighbors and fair dealing, she replied evenly. Perhaps we could all enjoy the music tonight and save negotiations for a more appropriate time? For a moment, tension crackled between them. Then Harrington inclined his head slightly. As you wish. Though time is a luxury in railroad business. He turned back to Quinn. Monday, my office. We'll finalize one way or another. As the railroad men moved toward the refreshment table, conversation gradually resumed around them. Quinn drew Grace aside, his expression troubled. You shouldn't have involved yourself, he said in a low voice. These men aren't to be trifled with. Neither am I, Grace responded, meeting his gaze steadily. Cedar Creek is my lifeline too. Quinn ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. Grace, you don't understand what's at stake. They can make things very difficult, for both of us. Then we'll face difficulty together, she said simply. Something shifted in Quinn's expression, concern giving way to a different emotion entirely. For a breathless moment, Grace thought he might say more, might acknowledge the unspoken connection that had been growing between them for months. Instead, he offered his arm formally. Would you like some punch? Grace accepted his arm with a small sigh. I would indeed, Mr. Forester. The remainder of the evening passed in strained pleasantry, the earlier joy of their dance overshadowed by the railroad's looming presence. When Quinn escorted Grace home later that night, the silence between them felt heavier than before, filled with words neither quite dared to speak. The Monday meeting with the railroad became Tuesday, then Wednesday, stretching into a week of tense negotiations that kept Quinn in town far longer than he'd intended. When he finally rode to Grace's homestead late Friday afternoon, he found her mending fence along her western boundary. You're back, she said, straightening from her work. She tried to keep her tone casual, though she'd watched the Eastern Trail every day hoping to see him. Quinn dismounted, looking more weary than she'd ever seen him. It's done. I've signed the agreement with the railroad. Grace set down her hammer, giving him her full attention. And Cedar Creek? Protected. They get their depot and stockyards, but further south than they wanted. The creek remains untouched. He met her gaze directly. Your water rights are secure. Relief washed through her. Thank you. I know that couldn't have been easy. It wasn't. Quinn's expression remained troubled. But it's only the beginning. The railroad will bring more people, more businesses. Paradise Valley won't stay the same. Grace nodded, understanding his concern. The open ranges that had defined his way of life were gradually disappearing across the west. Change isn't always loss, Quinn. He looked at her then, really looked at her, as though seeing something new. No, it isn't, he agreed softly. After a moment, he added, I have something to show you. Can you ride with me? Curious, Grace agreed. Quinn helped her mount his horse, then swung up behind her. The closeness was both unfamiliar and somehow right, his arms creating a secure circle as he held the reins on either side of her. They rode in companionable silence for nearly half an hour, cresting a ridge that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. Quinn drew the horse to a stop at a spectacular vantage point where mountains framed the verdant landscape. I come here to think, he said, his voice close to her ear. When decisions weigh heavily. Grace understood why immediately. The view restored perspective, individual concerns seeming smaller against the grandeur of mountains that had stood for millennia. Below, Paradise Valley spread like a green tapestry, with the silver thread of the Yellowstone River winding through it. In the distance, she could see Quinn's ranch house and her own small homestead, surprisingly close from this elevation. It's beautiful, she breathed. It is, Quinn agreed, though when she turned slightly, she found him looking not at the view but at her. Something in his expression made her heart quicken. He helped her dismount, and they stood together looking out over the valley as the late afternoon sun bathed everything in golden light. The railroad men asked a question I couldn't answer, Quinn said after a long moment. They wanted to know why I was so insistent about protecting Cedar Creek when it's such a small waterway compared to my other holdings. Grace waited, sensing there was more. I told them it was about principle, about water rights. He turned to face her fully. But that wasn't the whole truth. The intensity in his eyes made Grace's breath catch. What was the truth? That I couldn't bear to see you harmed. His voice was low, almost rough. That somewhere between trying to drive you away and fighting a prairie fire beside you, you became important to me. More important than I ever expected anyone to be. Grace felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. At the vulnerability, she knew they cost him. "Quinn, let me finish," he said gently. "My whole life, I believed the only way to survive out here was to stand alone, to need no one. My father taught me that depending on others was weakness, and weakness was death on the frontier." He took her hands in his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "But these past months with you have shown me something different. There's strength in connection, in caring about someone enough to fight for them, not just yourself." Grace couldn't hide the emotion in her voice. "I came here believing I had to prove I could survive alone. That independence meant isolation. And now," Quinn's question was soft, hopeful, "now I understand that true independence isn't about doing everything alone. It's about choosing who to let into your life." She squeezed his hands. "And I choose you, Quinn Forester, stubborn as you are." The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Quinn lowered his head and kissed her, a gentle, questioning kiss that deepened as she responded. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, Quinn rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Grace Whitaker. I think I have since you drove that wagon straight past me after I told you to leave." Grace laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. "I love you too, though I'm not sure exactly when it happened. Perhaps when you helped save my home from the fire. Or when you stood beside me against the railroad men," he suggested, brushing a strand of hair from her face with tender fingers. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, they talked of possibilities, of joining their properties, of building something together that would withstand whatever changes the railroad brought, of a future neither had imagined possible just months earlier. "I still want my independence," Grace said as they prepared to ride back. "I didn't come all this way to simply be absorbed into someone else's life." Quinn nodded, understanding completely. "And I wouldn't want you any other way. We'll figure it out together, two stubborn, independent people building something stronger than either could alone." The following spring brought transformation to Paradise Valley. The railroad construction began in earnest, bringing workers, businesses, and the inevitable changes Quinn had feared. But unlike his predictions, not all changes proved unwelcome. On a perfect May morning, Grace stood before the mirror in what had been her small cabin, now expanded into a comfortable home that connected to a new barn and workshop. Her wedding dress, a creation of ivory satin with delicate lace trim that she'd ordered from Denver, reflected her new prosperity without abandoning her practical nature. A knock at the door was followed by Quinn's voice. "Are you ready?" "The preacher's getting nervous." Grace smiled. "It's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding." "Since when do you believe in luck?" came his amused reply through the door. "Besides, we've made our own luck, good and bad." She opened the door to find him in his best suit, looking more handsome than any man had a right to. His eyes widened at the sight of her. "You're beautiful," he said simply. Grace took his offered arm. "And you're breaking tradition. But I've never much cared for doing things the expected way." Together they walked to the flowering apple tree where the minister waited with a small gathering of friends, ranch hands who'd become like family, neighbors from across the valley, and even some of the railroad workers who'd come to know and respect the couple who'd found a way to embrace progress while honoring tradition. Their vows were straightforward and heartfelt, promising partnership above all else. When Quinn placed the gold band on Grace's finger, his hands were steady, his eyes certain. "I once thought loving someone was the greatest risk a man could take," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "Now I know that not loving you would have been the greater risk." Grace's voice was clear as she responded. "I came to Montana seeking independence and found that true strength comes from choosing the right person to stand beside. Not behind, not ahead, but together facing whatever comes." As they sealed their vows with a kiss, cheers erupted from their gathered friends. The celebration continued well into the evening, with dancing, feasting, and stories that blended their separate pasts into a shared history. Later, as twilight settled over their joint properties, now a thriving operation that combined Quinn's cattle expertise with Grace's innovative farming methods, they stood together on the porch of what had once been her small homestead claim. "Are you happy, Mrs. Forester?" Quinn asked, his arm around her waist. Grace leaned into his embrace, looking out over their land, at the creek that had first divided them, now flowing peacefully through fields that nourished them both, at the distant lights of the new town that had grown around the railroad depot. Happier than I ever believed possible, she answered truthfully. Though I'll always remember what I told you that first day. Quinn raised an eyebrow questioningly. Grace smiled, mischief dancing in her green eyes. I ain't pretty, sir, but I can cook. Quinn laughed, pulling her closer. You were wrong about the first part, completely right about the second. And I'm grateful every day that you were stubborn enough to stay. As am I, Grace replied, turning in his arms to face him fully. As am I. As stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, their kiss sealed a partnership forged through adversity and strengthened by love. Proof that even in the unforgiving landscape of the American frontier, two independent spirits could find in each other not limitations, but the freedom to build something greater than either could imagine alone.